everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's event. My name is Colleen Cottle, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, which devises allied solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise. In doing so, it leverages and amplifies the Council's work on China across its 15 other programs and centers. History has always been a key battleground in countries around the world, and this is especially true in modern China. The Chinese Communist Party, with its many levers of societal control, has ensured that its version of history is taught in schools and dominates mass media. However, in his superb new book, Sparks, China's Underground Historians and Their Battle for the Future, Ian Johnson challenges this notion that the party controls all facets of China's historical narrative. Ian details how over the past 2 decades, individual efforts to challenge mainstream historical narratives have grown into a nationwide network of writers, artists, and filmmakers. These individuals have been able to bypass censorship mechanisms to shed light on parts of Chinese history that have been all but erased. Despite harsh crackdowns, these underground historians produce pieces of counter-history for public dissemination that are circulated, banned, and recirculated online. These works challenge the party's whitewashing of history and fill in the gaps of China's heavily censored historical archives. Importantly, they also give a voice to those who have experienced China's silenced history firsthand, and they are contributing to a powerful collective memory of the past. Ian draws on his experience working as a journalist in China. His time there spanned the relative open years of the 1990s, as well as Xi Jinping's rise to power in 2012 and the subsequent years of Xi's tightening grip on power. Ian has seen the country go through periods of relative freedom and crackdown, and he's expelled from China along with other American journalists in 2020. In the current era of especially harsh censorship, Ian asks whether historical amnesia has prevailed in China. The story of China's underground historians is a complex one, and neither the party nor its dissenters have definitively won in the battle over China's collective memory. Today's event will begin with a fireside chat between Ian and our moderator, Bei Feng, President of Radio Free Asia. Then we will open up to our full panel discussion. It is my honor to introduce both of them before handing things off to Bei. Ian Johnson is the Stephen A. Schwartzman Senior Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. An expert on Chinese politics, society, and religion, he is also the author of The Souls of China, The Return of Religion After Mao, Wild Grass, 3 Stories of a Change in Modern China, and A Mosque in Munich, Nazis, the CIA, and the Rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in the West. Ian joined the Council on Foreign Relations in 2021 after a long career in journalism, during which he won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of China. Ian has spent much of his career living in China, beginning with his time as a student in Beijing in 1984. He later worked there as a correspondent for various outlets like the Baltimore Sun and the Wall Street Journal. He returned to China in 2009 and lived there until 2020, working as a writer for the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, and other publications. He also taught undergraduate studies at the Beijing Center for Chinese Studies. Ian has won numerous awards for his work, including 2 awards from the Overseas Press Club and 1 from the Society of Professional Journalists. In 2020 to 2021, he received a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholars Fellowship for the book we'll be discussing today. We're so excited to have Ian here with us. Next, it is also my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Bei Feng. As president of Radio Free Asia, Bei brings decades of experience covering China. She began at Radio Free Asia as a managing director for East Asia, overseeing the management and editorial content of its 5 East Asian language services, and later served as the executive editor, where she supervised coverage across all of Asia. Bei began her more than 20-year career in journalism as the Beijing bureau chief for U.S. News and World Report, where she won the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for her story, China's Stolen Wives. She went on to cover the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then became the diplomatic correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. Before coming to Radio Free Asia, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, overseeing public diplomacy and public affairs for Europe and Eurasia. She earned her undergraduate degree at Harvard University and was a visiting fellow at Oxford University and a Fulbright Scholar in Hong Kong. Bei, we are so delighted to have you here today. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's my pleasure to be here with all of you today, and with Ian, who is an old friend, Lao Pengyo, from when we were both in China in the late 90s, early 2000s. So I will launch right into it, although I wanted to say to both the audience that's joining us virtually that if you want to submit questions for after our fireside chat, please go to askac.org and you'll be able to submit your questions there. So to begin with, Ian, I just wanted to ask a very simple question, which is what inspired you to write this great book?
Well, as you mentioned, I returned to China in 2009, and I was trying to get my finger on the pulse of China. So I started what turned into a 30-part Q&A series with public intellectuals in China that's still on the website of the New York Review of Books. And there I began to discover that, of course, history, as we know, matters in every country, but in China, and especially in this time, it's really become a battleground. There have always been people who've challenged the Communist Party's version of history, but up until the late 90s, early 2000s, they were sort of lone wolves. There were people who maybe worked a little bit on their own, but since then there'd been a movement and that had developed over time. And that really intrigued me, and also the government's efforts to, especially as the Xi Jinping era took hold, to reassert control over this and to try to fight back against these citizen journalists, citizen historians, yeah.
That's really interesting. I do want to delve a bit more into this sort of underground network that you talk about that is more organized than one might expect, certainly more than I would have expected. So I'm curious what this network is and also just how it survives because, as we both know in Xi Jinping's China, it is very difficult to carve out any kind of space in civil society, and not to mention sort of historical narratives. I know you actually, not to give too much away about the book, but one of the really poignant anecdotes that you share at the end is from Wu Di, the publisher of one of these underground journals, and he talks about sort of the ability to grow and shrink to evade danger. And so, I'm curious, like, how they're able to survive.
Yeah, well, they're not an organization in the sense of something with bylaws and membership and so on, and we're all in this underground history network or something like that, like the History Channel or something like that. So it's something that's much looser. It's more of a movement, and we've seen this in other countries too, where over the past century, and in different times for different countries, ordinary people have gotten in the business of writing history, of collecting oral histories, of researching their family histories, of finding ways to publish books. In China, it just took off a little bit later. But so this is how it's sort of managed to survive. I think it's not something where you can arrest, 10 people or 100 people and that'll be the end of it. It's a bigger movement that's taken root. And I think it's also because over the past few years, especially when you mentioned that magazine Remembrance, which has been in continuous publication since 2008, they've also used more overseas people over the past few years. Chinese grad students in foreign countries in the United States and elsewhere who help with some of the back-end work. And you see a lot more interchange and flow from inside and outside China than in years past. So these are all things that have sustained this movement over time.
Right. And tell us about the namesake of the book, the magazine Spark, and how you actually got into, sort of initially being introduced to some of these writers and historians.
Yeah, Sparks comes from this magazine called Spark, which was founded in 1960 by students who had been caught up in a political campaign, and they were exiled to Western China, to Gansu province to work in labor camps. And there they witnessed firsthand what most historians reckon to be the world's worst recorded famine, with up to 45 million people dying. And they saw things like cannibalism and the most horrible things imaginable. They thought that if they started a magazine, that this would alert the government to the problem. So they got hold of a mimeograph machine, which some people will know is a way to sort of crank off copies of things before photocopy machines existed. And they made a very simple 8-page newsletter, magazine, and they wrote very trenchant critiques, and they wondered, how did the famine start? And they said it was because lack of freedom of expression, that farmers don't own their land and have no right to decide how they want to farm their land. Therefore, they got caught up in these government policies that caused the famine. And the whims of the authoritarian leader, these are all issues that were important in 1960 and are actually still important today in 2023. So they wrote this down. They were closed down immediately within a few months by the government. 40 people arrested, 3 were executed, the rest were sent to labor camps. That would have been the end of it, except some people were able, one of these students was able to look in her personnel file, which is a dossier that the government keeps on everyone in China. It includes banal things like what your high school grades were, but also maybe your police record, if you have a police record. And she found 500 pages of everything about her case. She took photos of it, and it sat in her apartment in Shanghai in the 1980s and 90s. Nothing happened to it until the advent of simple digital technologies, a very simple one, a PDF. And with PDFs, you can then recreate this stuff. You put the photos together, and voila, you have the magazine, Spark, again. People began to circulate this starting in the late 90s. And not just the magazine, but all the incredible wealth of information that was in this police dossier, including love letters that she'd written to her boyfriend, who was a founder of the magazine and who was executed. And all of this stuff began to circulate. It inspired documentary filmmakers, including arguably, I think, the country's best-known documentary filmmaker, Hu Jie, who lives in Nanjing, to make 2 outstanding films about this magazine. And it became a touchstone for China's counter-history movement. And so that's why I titled the book Sparks.
And so were the themes that they wrote about back in the 60s in Spark magazine, were they still resonant today?
Yeah, they are. And even when it came out in the late 90s, one of the well-known critic in Beijing, a translator of Vaclav Havel, Cui Weiping, she said, now we have our genealogy. Like, now we know that there were people before us who were struggling with the same issues. Lack of freedom of expression, having to follow the whims of the leader, lack of freedom over economic policies that plagued China then in 1960, just a little over 10 years after the founding of the PRC, and now in the late 90s and even today when you look at China under Xi Jinping. So it creates this collective memory of resistance to party rule that people didn't know existed. They didn't realize that, wow, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, there were all these people also grappling with it. And so these magazines and these books begin to circulate again, things that were once banned, that maybe only existed at a research library in the West, now you can get inside China.
And so you actually start the book with a pretty poignant Hannah Arendt quote. And if you don't mind, I'll just read it here. Eyes so used to darkness as ours will hardly be able to tell whether the light was the light of a candle or that of the blazing sun. And I'm wondering, in China today, what is the perspective of the average Chinese citizen? I mean, have they actually, have they become subject to the historical amnesia that the Chinese government is sort of trying to instill? Do they see the light of a candle? And what do you see as, what the trajectory is?
Yeah, I think that quote by Hannah Arendt, and I think I say in the conclusion, it seems funny to start a book on 21st century China by quoting a mid-20th century Central European scholar. But she was quoted actually by one of the main characters in my book, Jiang Xue, a citizen journalist, who wrote this at the beginning of one of her essays. And it's hard to know when you see people like this how to judge what their impact on history will be. Is it just a flickering candle that might blow out, or is it a blazing sun that might actually amount to something a lot more later? So to get to your question, it's impossible to really know. I think most people, like most people everywhere, they are caught up in their daily life. They're not thinking about issues like this. But, and especially over the past, say, 30 or 40 years, when you have double-digit economic growth, I think China for like 30 years had roughly 9% compounded growth every year. That papers over a lot of cracks in society. People are willing to say, yeah, I don't like the party, or I don't like the government, I don't like this and that, it's corrupt, but tomorrow's a better day. I can afford to buy an apartment, my kid's going to college, and we can travel now internationally. Things aren't so bad. I'll just hold my nose and keep going. But if you think, and I think a lot of people do, that era is over, and China faces a period of slower economic growth, demographic challenges, a whole host of problems that are going to make the next 10 years a lot harder than the previous 30, 40 years, then people, I think, begin to look for alternative explanations for how society works. And I think that's when people look at people like these underground historians, these citizen historians, intellectuals, because much like in the Cold War in Central and Eastern Europe, when things go south a little bit in your country, you begin to look for other sources of explaining reality rather than the party's version, which might work okay initially, but when problems arise, it doesn't seem so convincing anymore.
Right. So on that note, where would you situate the white paper protests from last November in this historical trajectory?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. The white paper protests, these were limited but still significant protests in several big Chinese cities a little over a year ago against the harsh COVID lockdowns, but probably also underlying it was the economic slowdown, high youth unemployment of 20%. So those protests, you could think of them as an outlier, that in the previous 10, 20 years, there really hadn't been protests like that in China. Or if you think, as I do, and I think a lot of people do, that the coming years are going to be harder in China, they could be also harbingers of a less stable time in China. And if you look what's happened since then, the weird political instability at the top with the foreign minister, the defense minister, leaders of the military vanishing, and again, the economy being stubbornly slow, you begin to think that that may be significant. And it was interesting that during those protests, some of the people I write about in the book came to the fore. Like the journalist Zhang Shui, she wrote articles that went viral inside China for explaining the problems in her country. So I think that those were really quite significant, perhaps. Yeah.
And lastly, I'm just going to ask what we can do from the outside. What would you say is the most useful way to engage these underground historians?
Well, I think one of the best things to do is to try to, and this is in the conclusion of my book, I have a bit of an appeal to civil society to try to give some of these people more of a platform. And it's sort of irritating to me that in the Cold War, leading intellectuals from Central and Eastern Europe, among educated people in the West, were household names. Václav Havel, the filmmaker Milos Forman, etc., Kundera, the novelist. But it's not the same in China. And I don't know if that's, there are various reasons for that, but I think that there are ways that film festivals, universities, think tanks could engage with these people more. Some of them are in sensitive positions. One of the people I write about in the book, Ai Xiaoming, she's not allowed to leave China. So inviting her over on a fellowship or something wouldn't work. But I think you could, and also translate more of their works. One of the biggest hurdles is language. So we should try to encourage publishers, or this is also something that foundations can do, to maybe put aside a pot of money to translate more of this stuff so that people are more aware of it. And that is incredibly, I think, inspiring to the people back in China, to have that recognition, to know that somebody cares. Yeah. You know, people often ask me, did they mind that you wrote about them in the book? And on the contrary, they were happy that somebody wrote about them, because there isn't really enough attention paid to them. So I think that simply by, we often wonder in the United States especially, should we engage with China? The word engagement is taboo. I think you can engage with China. You can engage with this kind of China. The other China. You don't have to engage, on some level you do have to engage with official China, but you can also engage with unofficial China. And I think that's the way we can support them.
Great, thank you so much. And at this time, I'll welcome our two panelists up to join us. Thank you so much. And let me introduce you both. So Eric Schlussel is a professor of history and international affairs at GW. He's a social historian of China and Central Asia, and his work focuses on Xinjiang. He's also a talented translator who just translated an important work from Uyghur. Katie Stallard is the senior editor at China and Global Affairs at The New Statesman, and author of the book Dancing on Bones, How Past Wars Shape the Present in Russia, China, and North Korea. So welcome to both of you. I'm really glad to have you here. And I wanted to just start out by asking, I'll start with you, Katie, if that's okay. If you can, give us your perspective, having reported from China, North Korea, Russia, how you see sort of the themes of Ian's book and the importance of history for many of these authoritarian regimes.
Sure. Yeah, I think I would start by saying one of the things I value most about the book is the hopefulness. I think it's very easy to tell a story about China that is just unremittingly bleak, that is the repression, the throttling of civil society, and I think that carries some water for the regime. It suggests that there isn't another China out there. So I think the value is on focusing on these individuals who are refusing to be crushed, who feel this responsibility to history, and who are doing this work in the full knowledge that it might not be shared widely now, but as I think Ian describes them as thinking in terms of time capsules for the future, that they are speaking to future generations and wanting to inspire them as they themselves have been inspired by past figures. I think a couple of points I would make are, I think you see a parallel in the shift that's taken place that Ian describes under Xi Jinping with the verdict Deng gives after the Tiananmen massacre, after the crackdown in 1989, where he talks about our biggest mistake being in the field of education, that we haven't done enough to tell people about the need for hard struggle, what kind of country China was to become, essentially to make the case for why the Communist Party needs to be in power. And I think when she comes in, there's no Tiananmen, but there is a similar sense of crisis, of we can't be complacent, we can't just take ideology for granted anymore. We need to make a similarly concerted push to the post-89 period. And I think he has clearly spent a lot of time thinking about the collapse of the Soviet Union, the factors that led up to that, and he sees history as this really key ideological battleground. And you start to hear all this talk about historical nihilism as this false ideological trend that could undermine the leadership of the party. So I think there is a real shift that is happening now that we've seen perhaps only really with that level of urgency post-1989. And then just the second point I would make to sort of broaden this out to other countries are the parallels between Xi's approach and Putin in Russia. I think similarly there, you have these two leaders who have thought a lot about the collapse of the Soviet Union, who have personally experienced what happens when you lose power, when you lose control, and who have thought very hard about the case that they're making now for why they need to be in power. I think, again, it's very easy to sort of focus on the outside, from the outside, on the authoritarian nature of the regime, to present them almost like these kind of Bond villain figures who are ruling primarily through repression and force, and certainly that is part of it. But I think we can tend to miss the story that they're telling about why they personally need to be in power, and the emphasis that they're putting on the ideological sphere. I'll stop there to leave time for more discussion.
No, that's great. Thank you. And Eric, in your research, I'm sure the question of history has come up quite a bit, and I'm curious, what your thoughts are about the themes that were in Ian's book.
Absolutely. I completely agree that this is a very hopeful book, which I think we need very badly right now. You said just now, Ian, there's a kind of China we can engage with. And I'm glad we're reminding people that China exists that in many ways is still quite vibrant. It remains as roots and rhizomes underneath the soil, right? About to rise up in a new kind of historical force. I appreciate that the book is full of people making history, right? And not shadowy forces that dominate parts of the world. One thing I often tell my students is that we are narrative beings. We live in stories, right? And the stories we tell about our past inform our sense of the possibilities for the future. And I think what you see here in Sparks, it's a wonderful book. It illustrates the way that, one, that is very much true, but two, that the Communist Party also knows this really well. Now, just as a little extra background, I think when I was reading the book, I was thinking of how, for decades, especially under the Mao era, the party focused on having people tell their own stories, but through predetermined political narratives, right? Shaping their own selves, their own sense of their own pasts, to grander histories in which they were supposed to be taking part, right? You talk about persecuting the landlords, right? That's a historical struggle you're supposed to be part of. But what's so odd now is that today the official narrative is actually really elitist. You know, for a state that is nominally devoted to the raising up of the common people and the worker and the peasant, the present history being pushed by Xi Jinping and the Communist Party today really focuses on the imperial past and claims to that, and the importance of respecting the authority that once made Chinese history. One of the places you feel this the most, I'm a Xinjiang specialist, right? I work on the Uyghur homeland, and out there you've been feeling it very strongly for years, as there have been increasing restrictions on the use of local historical sources to even talk about the region's past. I mean, I've been at universities where I've been said, well, we're being told now we can only use sources that were written in Beijing 200 years ago. You know, halfway across Asia to talk about our local history. Like, there's a real attempt to craft a very flimsy and very alienating narrative. But Uyghurs have been doing this kind of counter-history for decades. You know, and I saw so many parallels with what I see in Sparks, with especially the use of historical novels, which in Uyghur are often footnoted. You know, so they look a little bit like histories, and they have, you know, that kind of historical apparatus, but they tell stories about people's pasts that are finding a place within the official realm of acceptability. Because technically they're fiction, right? They're fictions. So I saw so many parallels here, and I don't know, I just really want to thank Ian once again for writing a book that shows us that history is important to the study of China, not just as a field of contestation, but as a way of knowing the world. And that reminds us that narrative is a big part of, as you put it, how societies develop.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I am curious. We were talking before about the role of technology and how that actually either helps or hurts the ability of authoritarian regimes to control history. So I'm curious. I mean, I can start with you, Ian. You know, how do you see? I mean, you talk about how Spark went from, you know, mimeographed copies to having the impact that it has now because it's because of the internet, basically. And but on the flip side, there's the surveillance state in Xinjiang. So I'm curious what you think of the role of technology in this.
Yeah, the surveillance state is real. For anyone who's been to China, you see there's closed-circuit televisions on every corner, and there is facial recognition software, and one can posit a future where the whole country is a lot like Xinjiang, where you walk down a street and people can track where you walk. Of course, they can track where you walk by using your mobile phone, which even when you put it in airplane mode is a homing device, essentially, right? But yeah, I think that all of that is important, but at least for now, a lot of surveillance in China, most surveillance is still done by people, by boots on the ground. And this is something that we saw with the COVID lockdowns when they wanted to enforce that. It bankrupted a lot of local governments because they had to have all these people do the testing, they had to set all this stuff up. One of the people I write about in the book, this old gentleman who lives on the outskirts of Chengdu, Tie Liu, he estimates that there are 6 to 8 full-time police officers who watch his place. You know, they always have to work in teams of 2 because they don't trust that the person will actually do it. So it has to be another person watching the person who's watching. And then you have 3 shifts a day, and you end up with, you know, 6, 8 people who have to watch this old geezer, right? And he's just running a tea house now. He's kind of retired. And that's a lot of money. If you're like the local government, it's not like there's some giant Ministry of Public Security that has a gazillion people that they can send down from Beijing is pushed down to the local level. So if you're the local police chief and you've got youth unemployment, you've got other problems, you've got real crime, you got this, that, and the other thing, and then you got to second 6 people to watch this old guy on the edge of town, it's a lot of money. And it reminded me to some degree of East Germany, which I visited before the wall fell, and the bankrupting cost of the Stasi, which was a huge apparatus. And of course, China is much more economically vibrant than any East Bloc country, than say East Germany was. And so they can afford to waste money. But China is also in another struggle, which is the struggle to move from a mid to a high income country. And to do that, they have to have a better education system. They have to do a whole lot of other things that cost a lot of money. So if you want to burn roughly 10% of GDP, and this is what some estimates are for domestic surveillance, on that hampers you in your effort to become a truly developed, rich, powerful country. So it is something that's going to, that does hamper the movement, but it also hinders the government also. And it also means that on the local level, things aren't as airtight as you think.
Right.
Because this guy, he says, well, they're supposed to be there all the time. But when I went to visit them, for example, they weren't there. They were off on some siesta or something like that. So, you end up going in, and then later they come back and say, oh, what are you doing there? And then you just, So it's not quite like you think it is from the outside. And when you get to China, like in every place, it's a lot messier
Right.
than it seems.
Right.
Although places like Xinjiang are quite different. There, it's really is in lockdown, I think. And you probably know that better than I, but yeah.
Do you have thoughts about?
A couple of thoughts is that yes, I mean the level of surveillance in Xinjiang, although there are reports of it easing a little bit lately, is extremely high.
Yeah.
It's very difficult for people to move around. But I know Uyghurs have long used a variety of technologies to get around these sorts of restrictions. It's not just about printing things, doing samizdat in the classic sense. The circulation of audio files has been of vital importance to the articulation of different ideas of the self and of history in the Uyghur region for decades, on cassette tapes, later on thumb drives, right? And who knows what's actually happening today? I think Uyghurs have always been very good at telling their stories in code through song and through poetry, which is a very important genre in the Uyghur region, as is in China, right? In order to communicate all sorts of dissent that is illegible to the party. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's been such a crackdown since 2017, because I think the illegibility of Xinjiang to the state is deeply offensive to the Xi Jinping regime.
I would add to Uranian's point about what we can do from the outside. I think a lot of the time we're not talking about super high-tech connectivity in terms of technology. We're talking about photocopies, PDFs, and the ability to preserve those often now outside China and Russia. So I think a lot of what we know about the Soviet period is from the period when the archives were open, when people were able to make copies, and when people brought them out, and people have boxes and boxes still here. So I think one of the things that we can do, rather than sort of despair about how terrible the situation, is to make it as easy as we can for scholars to come here, for students to come here, and people to bring diaries, journals, basic information so that it can be preserved as an alternative narrative outside China and outside Russia.
Before we go to, because there are quite a few audience questions already, and again, don't forget, it's askac.org if you want to ask a question. But before we go to that, I just have one final question, an easy one, a softball, if you will, which is, if I were to ask, how you see the arc of history bending in China. What would you say? What's your prediction for how this all goes?
So, as Oswald Spengler here on the desk, the arc of history. Well, I don't know. I mean, but I think what we're looking at right now is an effort by the party that's been going on pre-Xi Jinping to reassert control over society in general, and I think by some accounts, it looks like this is backfiring in terms of government of priorities like economic growth and so on and so forth. So it's possible to construct an optimistic scenario. There are a lot of pessimistic scenarios for the future of China, being run as a military power that tries to dominate the world, et cetera, et cetera. But a more optimistic, although not entirely optimistic, scenario is that Xi Jinping stays in power another 10 years. The economy continues to decline. There are a lot more problems. And when he dies, the party says, that didn't quite work out the way we thought it was. We need to loosen up a little bit more. And they appoint a kind of Deng Xiaoping style or Hu Yaobang style, another former party secretary who's more of a reformist, to run the country. And that could allow things to loosen up, and who knows where it goes from that point. But it's not necessarily going to lead, the future of China isn't necessarily, there's a great quote by Havel, and he says it's a mistake to think that the face that a country presents itself today is the face that it will always have. The potentialities inside a population are much greater than that. And he said that in 1987, so 2 years before the Berlin Wall fell. Yeah. And I think that's something we should keep in mind with China. The China we see now is not the same China that we'll see in 10 years from now. It could be worse, but it could also be better. And just as we were perhaps too optimistic 20, 25 years ago that everything was going to straight line up toward more and more and more openness, we're making a mistake now to assume that everything is going to straight line down to a totalitarian military junta or something like that. Yeah.
I mean, the present policies are opening new historical wounds, much like those that Ian describes in his book, that I think are going to remain open for a long time and will come back to haunt the country in the near future. Quite frankly, I think the party thinks that it's actually capturing hearts and minds in Xinjiang, and it's not. I think they're going to leave a generation feeling deeply wounded and dislocated. And just like in the Soviet Union, when Stalinists tried similar things, they're going to have future generations who want to reclaim that thing that they feel is lost but can't quite approach.
I would just add, so there's a phrase in Russian, bez alternativnost, alternativelessness, which I think Putin and Xi cultivate, the sense that there is no alternative version. Our way is the only way. And I think what you see in these very brave individuals is the preservation of an alternative past and therefore an alternative future. And I think it's always fascinating to me to see where the resources go and how difficult these embers are to totally snuff out. It's fascinating that what we perceive as these all-powerful regimes are expending huge resources in surveilling what are often pensioners, soldiers' mothers. So I think the people in power in these countries are not, there is an inherent fragility in where they choose to spend their resources, and a sense that they certainly have not written off the possibility of an alternative.
Indeed. I'll go to some questions here, and also anyone from the audience, the live audience is welcome to ask a question as well. But one question is to Ian, how did you identify or connect with these underground historians, and does the Chinese government allow their work or crack down on it?
Well, one of the first people I interviewed for this Q&A series was the historian Yang Jisheng, who wrote Tombstone, which is a history of the Great Famine. And through people like that, you begin to read about people, and I would just call them up or get introductions. And living in China for that period of time and working on the book gave me the luxury of spending a bit of time. You can go back and get to know people and so on and so forth, and see them in the field when they go out to work and find out when they're going to go shoot a film or something like that. So it was a question of time, I think, and then just one introduction leads to another, like any kind of research project that you're on. That was mainly it. And yeah, the works are not allowed by the government. They're almost all banned. I didn't want to use the word dissidents because some of the people in the book have one foot inside the system. They're university professors. These people, they do quote unquote normal things like own property and have children and stuff like that. So they're not all holed up in a garret someplace, writing something with the police knocking at their door. Some of them are like that, but it's a spectrum of people. Some of them are kind of normal people who are just going about their business, but feel it's their obligation to tell this story, to tell the truth. And you find people like that in every society.
Yep.
But
fascinating. And was there a watershed moment or moments that you noticed during your time in China between 2009 and 2020 when you noticed that things began to change for the worse?
Yeah, there are a lot of moments. Actually, it's like a sequence of events. Brady, how detailed do you want to get? No, I mean, when Xi Jinping took power in 2012, his first public appearance was at the National Museum of History in this exhibition called The Road to Rejuvenation, which is the sort of story of how the CCP saved China. The next year, he essentially banned criticism of the Mao era, but maybe the most interesting was 2016, when he essentially closed down this alternative history journal called China Through the Ages, which his own father had championed. And his father had been a senior party leader and represented this reformist wing of the party that thought that for the party to survive, it needed to explore these dark corners of its past. And for whatever, you can have a Freudian analysis of he's going against his father, why? Maybe he thought the old man was too weak, and that's why he got sidelined in the Mao era. But for whatever reason, Xi Jinping disregarded that and closed down that journal in 2016.
Amazing. So, and a question for whoever wants to answer. How do you anticipate China's surveillance state to evolve in the coming years? What's your perspective on the CCP's ideal end state regarding surveillance and the attempted replication of it that we're seeing abroad in some parts of the world? You want to go ahead?
And I'll take that for the Xinjiang. I think that we don't know what the end game really is. Leaked documents suggest that Xi Jinping and the government are quite serious. They really do believe that re-education and widespread surveillance will change the attitudes of ordinary people and will reform them. I've even heard someone tell me quite directly that the question of Tibet is considered resolved because surveillance has been so effective there. The actual end state is very hard to determine because, well, for one thing, these things gain their own logic and they just spiral out. There's so much mission creep. Another CFR book has sort of demonstrated why that is, right? And besides which, surveillance has now become so pervasive, it's become part of everyday life. The question is that sustainable? Technologically, financially, ideologically? It's really hard to know where this actually ends up within China.
Indeed. Did you have anything to add? There's actually a question for you next. What types of overlap between Beijing's method of controlling historical narratives are there with other authoritarian states like Russia or North Korea?
I mean, I would say it's twofold. There's both a real effort to project and front and center the desired narrative. So in the Russian case, for instance, with the history around the end of the Second World War, massive resources. And one of the first things Putin does when he comes into power is start the Pobeda, the Victory Committee, whose sole task, and it involves the heads of the major security agencies, is to turn their attention to perpetuating the history of the war and ensuring that it's passed from generation to generation to generation. So there's both a real effort to center the desired version of history and then concerted efforts to shut down alternative versions, which I think you see particularly in the Russian case, when times are good and there's less a sense of external threat, an ability for civil society groups to exist alongside the state. So groups like Memorial, which comes out of the late Soviet period, Putin's first couple of decades does continue to exist and continues to do its work. And he actually goes to the opening of one of their exhibitions. But then, on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, or the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Memorial is one of the organizations that immediately is liquidated. I think in times of peril, there is this sense that this is a threat, this can't be allowed to go uncontested. So I think it's both really making an effort to push and to dominate the discourse, so to have unified historical textbooks, to have students have to memorize the right answer for their exams, to have officials have to reference the correct version of history, and then an increasing intolerance for anything around the sides of that, which they are in both countries also prepared to legislate against.
Indeed. Ian, how did you go about making sure that the way you conducted your research was ethical and adequately protected your sources?
Yeah, I did the basic journalistic method of simply asking people if they were comfortable with going on the record. And I continue to ask them, because I was starting to interview people in the early 2010s, but as the Xi Jinping era went on, it got more and more sensitive, right? So things that you could talk about in 2012, you could discuss them now. Some people were apologizing for the Cultural Revolution and stuff like that. That became increasingly difficult. But up till last year, when the manuscript was sort of finalized, I was still talking to people, and I still stayed in touch with them. And they were all okay with it. The people I describe in the book, the main characters, are all pretty well known in the scene. These are not, so there are other people who I talked to who said, yeah, I don't really want to go on the record. And those people were fine, but their information was useful for me as context and background, but I just left them out of the story. So it's a little bit different in academia, especially in the social sciences. People anonymize all the time, but I worry that that's a slippery slope toward fictionalizing stuff, which is not what they want to do. And I think a lot of these people, they want their stories to be told because they're proud of the work they do. They want to go down in history as the people who tell the truth about a certain thing. They don't want it to be forgotten. So, just by asking.
Yeah, that's great. And another question, which for any of us, please comment on the role of religion in sustaining the historical narrative outside officially atheist channels. Do you want to
talk about it?
Yeah.
Quick thought is, I mean, when you look at Uyghur society, for example, there are ways of embodying history in ritual and recitation that are mainly centered around religious practices, worship at shrines, for example. You might be aware the Chinese state has been bulldozing traditional shrines in the Uyghur region. And that is in part because they know that these are places where people go and they retell their own kind of history that is rooted in Islamic practices and theology, and thus is completely incommensurable, just not compatible with the primary official narrative. But I think that's one of the places where history is, as Ian says in his book, really embodied, is in that reenactment and that retelling.
Yeah.
I'd like to get Katie's view on this also, because something I've noticed that Xi Jinping has been doing is almost taking a page out of Putin's playbook in supporting some religions and persecuting other religions. So I kind of view the persecution of Islam and Christianity as one side of the coin, but the other side of the coin is the support, or at least the tacit support of Buddhism, Taoism, and folk religious practices to kind of create essentially a state religion. And I keep thinking of Putin and his embrace of the Orthodox Church.
Yeah, so I think it's part of this sense that there is a right way to be Russian, and part of that identity is you are a member of the Orthodox Church. And he does this thing, I think it's 2020 or 2021, where he opens there's a new cathedral on the outskirts of Moscow, which is dedicated to the victory in the Second World War. And he opens it with the Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, right next to him. And it's this very clear visual of God and history are on my side. And I think there is a co-opting of patriotism, which I think also does have some lessons for people in democracies too, a sense that it is unpatriotic to remember the darker elements of history, that we should focus on the good and the great and the glorious myths, rather than it's only people who hate Russia or who are enemies of Russia and China who would choose to focus on the atrocities and the darker chapters of the past.
We have a question for Eric. How sustainable are Uyghur efforts to preserve their culture in the long run? What do you think foreigners can do to support this work in a responsible and ethical way?
I mean, I am very, very, very pleased to see what especially Gen Z and young millennial Uyghurs are doing in the diaspora. Organizations like the Tarim Network, for example, and various other Uyghur youth organizations are developing textbooks, and they're opening up spaces through podcasts, through websites, and through all sorts of publications for members of the Uyghur diaspora to engage in art and literature and to build community in ways that are very flexible and very open. They're not promoting a very narrow, museumified idea of what it is to be Uyghur. In the diaspora in places like Virginia, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Los Angeles, Australia, of course, I think they're really heroic efforts. And Uyghur culture has been around for a very long time. It is inscribed upon the hearts of many people in that region, and it will not easily be erased, especially if there's such an active, dedicated, and especially open-minded group of people helping to keep it alive outside of China.
Thank you. Actually, related to that, does the United Nations provide a useful forum to play a positive role in preserving cultures that are being snuffed out by authoritarian regimes? Or do multilateral institutions in which Beijing is a member of prevent useful dialogue?
I'll just say it's very, very tricky because there's a question of, say, the status of Uyghurs or Tibetans within China, which is officially a sort of anti-imperial state. And so often it feels like these people do not get a lot of traction at the UN, but that's not my field. So I'll say people are very frustrated with organizations like the UN, which don't seem to be able to push China to do very much.
It used to be the Unrepresented Peoples Organization that, right, the UNPO, but it wasn't really a UN body. It had some observer status. Weren't there Uyghurs who were running that at some point?
They're certainly involved in that, yes.
Yeah.
But there's a question is, does that do anything?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Or is it just
I think also some of this would be through UNESCO, but China has such a grip on UNESCO, and especially things like intangible cultural heritage, how they define it, and they even redefine some of these Mongolian, like throat singing is now becoming sort of like a Chinese intangible cultural heritage. So they try to expropriate that stuff. Yeah.
Just time for a couple more questions, unfortunately. But so China's police stations, sorry, did you have anything to, okay. China's police stations have been a headache. This is the question. Any information whether China's, so sorry, I don't quite know where that's going. So, okay. How did you find that the underground historians, artists, filmmakers, et cetera, were able to best coordinate into a more defined network? Does this type of underground movement have structure, or does it need to remain more fluid?
No, there isn't structure. So, yeah. But one of the things I could pick up on what Eric was talking about, the role of novels. Also in China, you find the well-known novelist Fang Fang, who wrote the diary, the Wuhan Diary, that was translated into English. She's written dozens of novels, and she has a novel out that is going to be translated and published next June called Soft Burial, and that's about the landlord campaign. And that's a way to use fiction to tell these kind of stories. And I think one of the things that one could do in trying to help people and engage them is to make them part of our global conversation, because there are people in the United States who are quite well known, like the Columbia University professor Saidiya Hartman, for writing about the enslaved person's voice by using essentially historical fiction to do that, because you can't exactly know what it was like. There were no memoirs of that time. So people are doing that also in China, in Xinjiang, and other parts of the world as well. And I think that recognizing that they're part of our global conversation rather than part of some exotic thing, Planet China, where they're doing strange things, would be useful.
Well, thank you all for this wonderful discussion. It's been a really enlightening hour. So thank you all for joining us as well.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Are we still on?